It is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. Maneesha Deckha is a professor and the Landsowne Chair in Law at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. She currently serves as the Director of Graduate Studies at the University of Victoria and supervises a number of doctoral and master's students in critical animal studies, feminist animal care theory, and law. She's a Brooks Animal Studies Academic Network Fellow, that's known as BASAN, and she's engaged in collaborations with other BASAN members, and I'm very pleased that Lewis and Clark Law School is also a part of that network, so we get to work together. Professor Deckha is co-founder and academic director for the Animals and Society Research Initiative, a growing research hub at the University of Victoria, which, with BASAN's support, has launched a distinguished lecture series for 2019-2020, among other initiatives. She was part of the plenary panel on the intersectional future of animal law at the inaugural Canadian Animal Law Conference earlier this month, and she is now embarking on a new major research project to consider whether the lack of government regulation of how farmed animals are raised and the general abdication by government to animal use industries to self-regulate is a violation of the rule of law. This project is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Tonight, Professor Deckha will discuss recent animal law developments in Canada and what we can all learn from our neighbors to the north, and we're in for a real treat. Please help me give a warm welcome to Professor Deckha.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pamela, for that lovely introduction. I'm just delighted to be here. I'd also like to thank Kathy, Raj, everyone on the planning committees at Lewis and Clark and at ALDF that invited me to be here with you tonight, and also all of the sponsors from the Brooks Institute and others who've enabled all of us to be here, and of course to Liberty and the students and all the team of organization for this amazing conference year after year. It's so wonderful. I think they deserve just one more round of applause. So I'd really like to dedicate this talk to all the animals that we have been talking about in the oceans, on land, caught up in the animal use industries. We've been discussing, especially those animals during this talk, and if you go to a website like Vegan Calculator and open it right now, are going to be losing their lives as we speak. So I really do want to bear witness to those animals. And I want also to just emphasize some of the themes I'm going to be talking about with respect to the Canadian developments. If we think, how did we get to this system today of such abysmal conditions for so many animals in the billions and trillions, I think we can identify multiple factors that create a confluence of causation. But I'm going to be talking about especially about the role of sexism, colonialism, and capitalism in creating this type of condition. And it makes me really happy to come and talk about comparatively the banner year that Canada has had in trying to make some inroads and interventions into this matrix of social forces that create the legal system that we have that enables all of this to continue. And I must say I was a bit kind of tickled to think of coming and talking to you about Canada as being a model on animals, because I've actually written a law review article some years ago about, I think Canada does very well on many social justice issues, but I don't think that animals is one of them. And I have written a comparative piece holding up the United States as a model. So let me talk about at least some of the things we've been doing this year that I hope will also be inspiring. So, okay. All right, so the talk today, I just want to break it up into introduce to you some of these developments that you may not be aware of that I see as quite pro-animal. Also acknowledge and talk about some of the limits, and then also think about what are some of the lessons we can learn thinking about these developments going forward, not just for one nation like Canada, but for the United States and obviously other jurisdictions. Okay, all right, so here's a map of Canada, just in case. Might have been a bit fuzzy, but where we are and how we are right to the north. So we have the 10 provinces at the bottom and the 3 territories. I was asked to put this map in, so just in case, it might be helpful. So here it is. My hometown, of course, is in Victoria on Vancouver Island, just north of Seattle. You can see the large population mass. We have, or the mass of, the land structure, and the population obviously, perhaps not obviously, but hovers very densely along the border with the United States. Okay. All right, so if we start talking about interventions, I think this last year in 2019, the first one that we really want to draw attention to and has received probably the most international coverage is the legislation package that passed into law this past June, and this is our anti-captivity bill for cetaceans. So addressing, the whales, the dolphins, the porpoises. This bill, called the Ending Captivity for Whales and Dolphins Act, has now illegalized the breeding, captive breeding, also the acquisition of reproductive materials into Canada of cetaceans, the import-export of cetaceans, the showing of cetaceans for entertainment purposes, and it was a bill that kind of laid onto a de facto reality where we didn't really have anyone coming to the federal government to ask for a license to capture, like say, orcas from the wild since the mid-1990s. But this law now does make that illegal, and no one is coming to ask for that. And it's important to understand why it's so monumental, and we can do that if we think about what is the regular type of pre-existing Canadian prohibitions about animal use and animal industries. And like many jurisdictions, we have a very welfare system, right? So if we look in our criminal codes and a few other statutes, we'll see that very few uses of animals, either human or corporate, are outlawed absolutely. Almost every type of use goes through that cost-benefit calculus of, is it unnecessary suffering, right? Unnecessary distress. And so we, in our criminal code, have comparatively long-standing prohibitions about no animal fighting, right? Bestiality outlawed. Although we had to kind of clarify exactly what was outlawed just this past year as well, because we had a Supreme Court of Canada case about what constituted that term. Captive bird shooting for the purposes of releasing birds then to shoot them. But everything else, through all the industries, research, entertainment, agriculture, went through the unnecessary suffering calculus, and because of tepid judicial interpretations when these cases do make it into court, and because of explicit categorical exemptions, all of that goes on, right? So in a context where bestiality, animal fighting, captive bird shooting are really the only things off the table completely, we now have anti-captivity of a type of species. And when you looked at some of the comments in the House in Ottawa, the federal level, when politicians were debating this bill, some of the politicians that were on the fence, not ready to kind of endorse it fully, or kind of pushing back on their colleagues who were very enthusiastic, said, this is the first time in Canada that we're saying it is illegal to hold an animal captive, right? And so this is part of the monumental significance of the statute. Okay, and then we've also in that legislative package in June rolled a provision in for sharks. So as the Congressman was saying yesterday in his address about shark finning, so Canada has now banned the import and export of shark fins into Canada. So it was several years ago, decades ago now, in the 1990s, when we prohibited the practice in Canada, but given the kind of, popularity of shark fins as part of a luxury culinary item for Chinese Canadians in certain cultures, otherwise we had a lot of importing of this in terms of outside of Asian countries. And so this has now been legalized as well. And in case we're not aware, there's about 70 million sharks every year kind of being killed for their fins, right? So quite an impact. And then, so the first two initiatives were about legislative change, right? So laws on the books. But I think it's also worth noting a very high-level change that came from Health Canada in January of 2019, so way early in this year. And that's our National Food Guide. So this is our new National Food Guide. And we can see a plate-based visual. But if we just take a look, right, even for those of us in the front and who can maybe see what's on the plate quite more clearly, we can see that 50% is visualized as fruits and vegetables. One quadrant are the grains, and the whole grains are emphasized. Another quadrant are the protein foods, right? And we do have to look in that quadrant for what are the kind of animal-based foods that are being depicted. And we see a little kind of vial of something that looks like dairy. It may not be dairy, may not be dairy yogurt, right? It might be not plant-based yogurt. It's hard to kind of see the pieces of animal flesh on the plate. And so this has been heralded as really a plant-based type of food guide that has been promoted. And in addition, Canadians are being told to make water your drink of choice, to eat less sodium, eat less saturated fats. And again, with the whale and shark fin bill, to understand why this is monumental, we really need to think of what existed before. So this food guide came after multi-year consultation by Health Canada, which is our federal ministry for promoting the health of Canadians, doing public health initiatives like what Canadians should be eating. And they received about 26,000 submissions from the public. I also participated in that as an individual member of the public, where they asked for input about proposed recommendations and other controversies that had bubbled up. And when the food guide came out, there was a lot of public institutional support. So major medical officers talked about the health-forward nature of the bill and really applauded the fact that Health Canada officials kept industry lobbyists at bay because, like in the United States, the meat and dairy lobbies are huge in Canada and really were responsible for our previous iterations of the food guide, starting from the first one in 1942. In terms of what was promoted. So let's just see the last version to see the difference, which started in 2007. So here's our kind of distinctive Canadian rainbow arc type of food guide that's been there for a decade. And we can see that there are 4 food groups, right, in this rainbow structure. And you have the outer groups of the fruit and vegetables and the grains. But then you had the blue arc representing milk and alternatives, as it's called. And you had the red arc, the innermost arc, representing the meat and alternatives. And so it was a multi-page guide, and even though the current kind of dietitian spokespersons for Health Canada tried to minimize the difference between the new guide, the plate-based visual, and the old guide, saying, for many years, for many iterations of the guide, we've been telling Canadians to eat fruits and vegetables, to limit salt, to limit saturated fat. I do think it is a dramatic change that has been instantiated. So if we just go into the 2007 guide, we can kind of see that. Because even though the inner arcs are smaller, so we can see visually that Canadians are through although there are 4 food groups and the animal-based ones have 2 out of the 4. They are the inner arcs, so fewer servings. You can see by the recommended servings that they're still quite substantial. So if you take an adult, 18 to 50, a male, they were advised in the old guide to drink 2 servings of milk and alternatives or have 2 servings, and 3 servings, right, of meat and alternatives, and women 2 and 2. If you looked at the depictions that were represented to Canadians about the alternatives in the blue and red categories, if you look closely at the blue category, you see that only 1 out of the 6 depictions are for plant-based alternatives, right? 2 milk and milk products, which was a soy milk depiction. And then in the meat alternatives, you did have half of the visuals being alternatives, so tofu's depicted, peanut or nut butters, and then cooked legumes, but still called a meat and alternatives category. And then further into the food guide, you'll see the blue again representing the dairy portion. Canadians, adults were told to drink at least 500 milliliters of milk a day to be healthy, right? And so, and you can see that animal flesh was represented as healthy in the red portion if we look closely. Okay, and even here where the top part is about be active, be healthy, the bottom visual is of an average kind of meal, and you see that the beverage is milk, and then you see the animal flesh on the plate, right? It's a standard meal that can be healthy. So I think it's really fair to say that in the old 2007 guide, there was still quite an emphasis on animal-based products, right? Especially dairy. And with the new guide coming back, right, we can see the difference. I'm hoping you'll agree with me that there is a difference here. And it is the dairy industry that has been felt put upon by this new visual because it's lost its standalone food group status. Nobody's telling Canadians anymore to drink 2 cups of milk a day, right? And it's not even clear that what is represented in that vial is a dairy-based product, given kind of the ubiquity now in supermarkets of plant-based dairy options. Okay, all right, so a high-level policy initiative promoting to Canadians what they should be eating is kind of the third example of some monumental change in Canada this year. And then the fourth example I want to give, something that has been talked about earlier in the conference, just mentioned, is another type of kind of more dispersed policy initiative that has to do with a decolonizing impulse with respect to Indigenous peoples in Canada, and overarchingly called as an umbrella term, reconciliation. So we started off with the map of Canada at the beginning, and here you can see a map from nativeland.ca that shows the contested territories, right? The colonial nature of the land that Canada's on, right? And so Canada, like the United States, is a settler colonial nation. We can understand that we're on colonial space right here in terms of thinking of the human original inhabitants that were devastated by the colonial process, the animal inhabitants as well. And so I want to kind of tease out why I see the decolonizing sensibility kind of encapsulated in this reconciliation movement that Canada is having as why it's also beneficial for animals. And so I just want to give a bit of background on this political social movement of reconciliation. So the term comes from many sources, but we can see it consolidated in a government-ordered body called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which did its work over many years and issued a report, a very voluminous, rich report a few years ago. And the TRC, as it's called, was set up itself as part of a settlement of a class action lawsuit emanating from the claims of what are known as residential school survivors. So like many nations that have gone through colonial relations, Canada had a residential school system that basically was a part of the federal government's kind of cultural genocide project against Indigenous peoples, mandating the removal of children from their families to basically be whitewashed and Christianized in government-sponsored schools run by churches. And this system went on for over 100 years, the last one closing not too long ago, just a few decades ago, and affected over 150,000 children. And there's been lots of studies and documentation of just the trauma to those children themselves, to the parents who lost their children, to the communities, and the intergenerational trauma that has resulted from the breaking of kinship networks and parenting skills, and just the abuse that the children themselves experience. Okay, so the TRC was tasked with a huge task of trying to talk about the causes, the experiences, and then recommendations to kind of put First Nations communities, Métis communities, Inuit communities, so Indigenous communities, to foster their respect among non-Indigenous Canadians. And this is the idea of reconciliation, of reconciling, right, our history in Canada of settler colonialism between non-Indigenous Canadians and Indigenous Canadians. And there have been multiple government initiatives to have this type of conversation in the past. So the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in the 1990s was also a big initiative. But I would say, and I think others have said in peer-reviewed work, that the reconciliation movement has really taken off and built momentum. So many forward-thinking, public-minded institutions, universities, law societies, law schools, other types of government institutions have taken up the calls to action and the recommendation that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have said must go, be implemented for Canada to move forward to trying to decolonize our relations with Indigenous peoples. So part of that work, and what's depicted here, is a painting by my colleague, Professor Valerie Napoleon at the University of Victoria. Part of those calls is to addressing the legal profession and legal education, and is to say, what has to happen in law schools is that law students have to learn not just the colonial legal order. So, right, in the English-speaking Anglophone schools, the common law, which is our British colonial legal order, and then of course the French colonial legal order, the civil law in Quebec, and also our national institutions in Ottawa. But Indigenous legal orders, right? So if we understand that part of the effect of colonialism was to not understand Indigenous values, norms, worldviews as laws in themselves, we now have to kind of revivify, revitalize these traditions and recognize them as laws. And so many law schools in Canada, mine included, have really tried to take this on. And so last year, actually, the University of Victoria launched its first trans-systemic degree. So we have other trans-systemic degree granting institutions in Canada, but they're typically the civil law, right, and the common law. So the two colonial legal orders are granted perhaps after an extra year of law school at the University of Ottawa, for example, or McGill University. So our program is trans-systemic, but students starting with the cohort last year will graduate now in 3 years, so it's a 4-year program with a JD, but also what we've called the JID, which is going to be a degree in Indigenous laws. So when they go through this program, they take individual courses, they learn the common law, and they learn an Indigenous legal tradition addressing that topic, whether it's contracts, torts, property. And so the idea is to put on par Indigenous legal orders as laws with the common law, with the civil law, to reflect the TRC's call to do that, and so that the colonial legal orders of the common law and civil law integrate, right, merge with Indigenous legal orders to integrate those legal traditions. All right, so how does this help people? So first, how does this help animals, right? So first, before going on to look specifically at reconciliation, I do want to acknowledge that the Canadian legal order, right, so what we can understand or have been calling the colonial legal orders, there is constitutional recognition for what are called Aboriginal rights, so Indigenous rights, in our Constitution. And there have been multiple legislation, litigation especially, that have fought for these rights and protests based on these rights. So we can see protests against our pipeline projects in Canada, and also protests here in my home province of British Columbia against the fish farms through invocations by Indigenous communities of Section 35 rights in our Constitution. So pre-existing in the colonial order, right? So the recognition from the common law of Indigenous rights. And so their title assertions, so about land titles, saying this title actually is belonging to an Indigenous nation, and we don't want the fish farms here because they're travesties, and we want to evict, and this is what this is depicting. But reconciliation is even beyond that, right? Because reconciliation and the TRC is saying, it's not just a recognition that Canada has given through the colonial legal systems of Indigenous rights in our colonial constitution. Reconciliation is supposed to take pre-existing Indigenous laws that were sublimated and elevate them so we can see them as laws, and then to integrate that into the legal orders. right? So here actually is just a copy of the the Anti-Captivity Bill, so the Ending Captivity of Whales and Dolphins Act that we talked about as our first example. And these are the words actually of the senator who carried forward the sponsorship of this bill. The first sponsor in the Senate retired as a mandate of 75. And so Senator Murray Sinclair took forth the sponsorship of this bill that eventually went through all the hoops to become law. And he was also the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? And is an Indigenous senator. And in the prelude to a recent journal mentioned by Professor Fernandez this morning, the Journal of Canadian Comparative and Contemporary Law, had these words to say about what reconciliation means, right? And here we're getting a sense of what it can mean for animals. So he said, in considering natural law, Indigenous traditional knowledge, and scientific evidence, we know that animals are sentient beings with social systems, complex means of communication and emotions, yet they are legally marginalized and vulnerable to maltreatment and exploitation. Okay, and then he goes on to compare that to indigenous ways of thinking of animals, right? And of course, we have to be careful of generalizations, but he also comments that there are certain types of values that are very different from the top-down kind of colonial ways of looking at animals that come from Western traditions, philosophical and onward, as we also heard this morning. So rather than exalting humans and a norm of human exceptionalism that characterizes, right, our property-personhood divide, Senator Sinclair talks about relationality, reciprocity, interdependence, ecosystems, seeing animals as kin, seeing them as equals. And then in his closing comments to his prelude for that special journal on animals coming out just recently, he says, so bear in mind why we're here. We are here to take care of our universe, to take care of our land, to take care of the people, and to take care of all that is part of this creation. So Nikwamizin, be strong and steadfast in your beliefs. Take care of all of our relations, so including animals, and be mindful that reconciliation includes our relationship with animals. So my take on this is that if there is sincerity about asking colonial legal orders and all mainstream legal, political, social institutions in Canada to indigenize, as the movement is there, and really take on values in all cores from Indigenous societies, including in legal arenas, Indigenous legal orders, that there is a strong argument for saying there's already legal personhood reflected in many Indigenous legal orders for animals, and that the common law and the civil law in Canada really have to catch up to this understanding of animals and integrate not a top-down, binary, human-exalting model, but a much more reciprocal model where animals are not derided, where they're not disparaged, where it's not an insult to be seen to be an animal or compared to an animal, rather they're seen as kin, and that could have a very monumental impact if it is taken seriously and it goes forward. Okay, so to go back to all of these examples, and let's just maybe think about some of the limits, right, that we can see. All right, so the first one, the Anti-Captivity Bill. So first of all, the current captive cetaceans are grandfathered into the legislation. And so that means the one very lonely dolphin named Helen at the Vancouver Aquarium in Vancouver, and the 60 or so cetaceans at Marine Land in southwestern Ontario, just outside of Toronto, close to the border. And so the legislation allows Vancouver Aquarium and Marine Land to keep these animals. And even though the legislation makes it an offense to use cetaceans for entertainment purposes, it's not clear, it might likely be a legal tussle about whether the so-called educational feeding sessions for Helen and at the Vancouver Aquarium, or her medical exams, are going to be for entertainment purposes. Certainly if you go on TripAdvisor or any type of tourist travel website, you will see people saying, go to the dolphin shows, right? And so taking it as an entertainment type of experience. And whether or not Vancouver Aquarium will have to be licensed for this is anyone's guess. And in the materials is a great article by Katie Sykes at Thompson Rivers, who goes over all of these unanswered questions about the statute. Also, we can obviously, if we see the comparison, understand that it's just a small smidgen of the animal world here that we think of as the animal world that comes under the purview of this statute, right? And of course, it's the humanized animals here, the orcas, that have led the charge on this legislation. And perhaps, so making it very precarious that any other animals will soon follow suit and get a similar anti-captivity legislation, especially those that are in industries that the majority of Canadians support and believe that there's not really any problems with. Also, quite soberingly and not well publicized at all, when it looked like the law was about to be passed, the federal government allowed marine land to export 5 cetaceans, and it's believed to be here to the United States, 2 of whom were pregnant. And also, astonishingly, Vancouver Aquarium, which presents itself as much different than marine land, which is like entertainment. The Vancouver Aquarium is serious conservation, right there for saving endangered species and educating the public. Also had 2 cetaceans at marine land, and those were exported out of the country to Vancouver Aquarium's sister institute in Valencia, Spain, Oceanographic, and which is kind of modeled on the, come and have fun, but learn something to model of the Vancouver Aquarium as well. And it also must be noted that even though it was about humanized animals, it was about a practice that most Canadians, bottom lines are not going to be affected by. It's just marine land and the Vancouver Aquarium that are holding cetaceans captive, that still this bill, when it was a bill, had many hurdles to get through, and it was not easy to get it passed in the legislative agenda, and took a lot more effort, a committee, to convince people to support it. Also, we can note this really interesting initiative that may have heard about called the Whale Sanctuary Project. So just as we think of the land-based animals hoping to go from zoos to sanctuaries or research labs to sanctuaries, there are a group of scientists and others trying to set up right on the coast of North America, the seaside, the oceanside sanctuaries, and the government is not supporting this work yet and actually has some opposition to it. Okay. And so the part of that is that the law allows, the new law allows captivity through a license for where a researcher or a facility can show that rehabilitation is needed or that's the best interest of the animal to keep them there, whereas the Whale Sanctuary Project would try to return them to a more natural environment, even if they needed lifelong human intervention and care. Okay. And then here is an excerpt of the amendment to the Fisheries Act that dealt with the shark finning. And we can also see that that also had a tough go through the legislative hoops. And it was just because of some trading by some willing politicians that it got high up in the legislative agenda that it could go forward. So again, a non-majoritarian practice, shark finning, still encountering a tough time to get past, not an easy kind of slam dunk situation. And also there was a kind of the invocation of some would call identity politics. Others would perhaps see a bit more nuance in terms of the arguments about race and culture, ethnicity that were articulated. You had business, restaurant leaders from the Chinese Canadian community coming forward saying, this is, we don't want any bans on shark fins, the importation. It's important to our industry, but articulating in the guise of a cultural right, and that had traction, and it took the dissenting voices from Chinese Canadian community to object to that, right? To say this is not a cultural right to serve shark fins. Not all Chinese Canadians support this, not all people in China support this, right? This is not a cultural right. So, possible derailment here in terms of getting the bill passed, and it's important to note before the federal government took charge of this, municipalities, including in Vancouver, with the sizable Chinese Canadian population, tried to make an intervention and stop it as well, and upon judicial review were reversed because it was seen to be outside of the jurisdiction to make that type of illegality. And if we come back to the food guide, so on one level, I've suggested to you that it looks like a huge change from what was there before, especially with respect to Health Canada and the civil servants in that ministries, their ability to hold industry at bay. They allowed them only input as one of any member of the public to go online and give their input. They didn't grant them private meetings. They didn't grant them position on advisory councils, as it happened in the past. At the same time, if you look at the overarching landscape of the support of the federal government, so the same government, right, for the animal-based agricultural industry in Canada, it's like of such a vast scope is mind-boggling. So you may have heard through the free trade negotiations between our two countries, right, the dispute about the dairy industry. Canada has a supply system management. Commentators have suggested the dairy industry wouldn't be viable without the subsidies coming from the government, federal government. There are lots of grant monies going to farmers to modernize new technology. There's federal government funding for the industry code regulation that gets to kind of present themselves as government oversight of farm animal welfare when we know it's not government oversight because it's industry driven. The federal government supports that. And other ways in which the Health Canada intervention here, while a positive development, is really an outlier in the overarching landscape of support. And probably the most sobering in this example is that within the same federal government, right? So it was a Trudeau government at that time, or we just had an election, right? It's still Trudeau government, but minority government. But still with the same government, at one hand you have Health Canada and the civil servants there, the policy analysts, trying to make this change and getting not just lobbied and holding industry at bay, but getting lobbied by their counterpart in Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada to not make the changes that they had proposed they were making and seeking public consultation on. So there's documented evidence of those civil servants in Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada trying to lobby their Health Canada colleagues, saying don't recommend anything to Canadians that's going to be deleterious to the industry, right? Don't say anything about the unsustainability of animal-based diet, denying that it's more unsustainable than a plant-based diet, and saying please don't do anything deleterious. So some sobering facts there too in terms of government support. But even, if we had a government that was fully on board with very kind of plant-based food guide, I think it behooves us to recognize that there's so many other social and cultural forces about what we eat and our associations with food, right? So we know it's not easy for people to transition who haven't grown up with a plant-based diet, with a vegan diet, to this diet, that even once they do transition, there's a lot of regression because of the immense social and cultural pressures that come to bear. And as feminists have long explained and demonstrated, these are highly gendered associations, right? So our codes of dominant masculinity correlate very much to what we eat, right? If you imagine, I think the New York Times several years ago had a great kind of opinion piece. If you're going out on it's a heterosexually oriented date, you want to connote femininity to your kind of new date. You want to connote masculinity to the new date. What are you going to order, right? Who is going to order the salad and who is going to order the steak? And so our norms of gender very much correlate to what is on our plate. And so even if the government was totally on board, we have to recognize that there are impediments to dietary change with just the instantiation of a new food guide. And the same thing with reconciliation. So our fourth example, first of all, reconciliation is, if we really dwell on that term for a moment, to reconcile, that might have one positive meaning on one sense, to bring to kind of, acrimonious or antagonistically placed groups historically together. But then there's also critical literature among Indigenous scholars and activists that reconciliation is too much of application. It's just a deference to the colonial status quo, and we really need a much more radical type of position vis-a-vis the colonial governments in Canada. And so I think that lends itself to the concern that even if the argument that Indigenous legal orders have to be mainstreamed in Canada and then giving animals a much higher status legally, right, and be recognized as legal persons, that might just be co-opted to humane treatment, which just might be equivalent to the current idea of humane treatment, right? And then I don't think we also can't ignore the ongoing debates within scholarship about what do Indigenous rights provide for vis-a-vis animals. What is a relational ethic vis-a-vis animals? Does it allow today in the modern day for commercial use of animals? Can that be respectful toward animals? Or even the subsistence kind of hunting, trapping, fishing debate. Does respecting animals allow for that type of hunting, fishing, and trapping, right? And so it's not clear that there would be wide-scale change immediately or that animals would be affected. So Fanny, what are some of the lessons in the last few minutes here about all of this? Well, first, how did the anti-captivity bill get going? The Senator Moore, Wilfred Moore, who sponsored it first, had watched Blackfish with his son. And his son said, "What are you going to do about this, Dad?" Right? And so I don't think we can underestimate the power of documentaries. As visually, as anthropocentric as our premium on site can be, we heard from Dr. Franks about that and others, many of us are moved by watching things. And this certainly played a role in the legal outcome here. Also, of course, this is a bill that talks about the humanized animals. And, but yet, it still encountered fierce resistance going forward. It wasn't easy to get it passed finally. And so I think that tells us a lesson that we have a lot of litigation and just kind of maybe a general sense that, we have to get the ideal animal clients and they have to be the humanized clients because that's what's going to resonate with the anthropocentric judges and mainstream public. And maybe that's so, but it's not necessarily the case that that's going to be effective, right? Or it's going to succeed. So I think, in other work I've talked about this, that there's a way to go forward for animals that avoids the humanizing terms, focusing right on mirror tests, focusing on cognition, focusing on intelligence, but rather talk about some of the other harms, which also came out of the Tillicum case in SeaWorld here in the United States, about forced breeding, about devastation of kinship networks, about mother-child separation, right? These things that so many animals go through that aren't so tied to what we value about paradigmatic humans. Okay, and I also think that part of the whale efforts and the shark fin efforts really show the power of peer-reviewed studies. And here's where I want to endorse what Dr. Franks was talking about in the morning, our need to align with like-minded scientists to kind of generate the data that is going to be persuasive. Because even when you have like-minded politicians who want to take something forward, if they can't go on a platform of something that's ostensibly neutral to the public, i.e. science, right, then it's hard to make that case. And certainly we can recognize that science is not value-free. It's not a neutral enterprise. It can be as culturally loaded as was talked about earlier. But I really do believe that aligning with science and bringing up data that is supportive to whatever cause it is that we're promoting is the way to go. I have been an external reviewer for dissertations in other jurisdictions where you see, again, the science-based arguments supporting the legislative reform, the litigation reform, and the value of that in getting things done. Okay, and these two particular peer-based studies are highlighting a work of some Indigenous scholars in Canada, which takes us to the lesson that I think is also important to remember, is that to really go forward well in campaigns, I think we need to build up, as animal advocates, our intersectional awareness and capacity to be able to and have comfort with talking about animal issues in relation to issues of race, into issues of culture, issues of gender, issues of class, and otherwise. Why is this important? A lot of my scholarship has talked about the synergies and between the objection of certain humans and animal objection, and talking about the underlying kind of objection of animality that undergirds so many types of different prejudices and forms of discrimination. And I also, not only do I think it's important to have an intersectional awareness of multiple social justice issues to really understand why animals are in the position they are, or what other marginalized human groups are in the position they are, but I think it also gives us a facility to understand how to avoid derailment of legislative campaigns, litigation campaigns that are threatened by kind of disingenuous claims about cultural rights, let's say, for example, in the shark finning case, or sincere questions about cultural rights, perhaps in the examples from I've given of subsistence hunting in the Indigenous rights claims. And so as I tell my students who kind of feel it's very weighty to get into all these debates without proper knowledge on all sides, and it is. It's challenging, it's difficult, it is hard to talk about race in relation to anything, let alone animals, but we have to have these conversations and have more facility in doing so, so that we can understand how to enter the conversations in a thoughtful way. And both Margaret Robinson and Billy Barrett-Bulcourt are Indigenous scholars who make the case for veganism, right? Who have showed dissenting viewpoints of what we think are monolithic viewpoints in certain communities or cultures for how a community or culture thinks about something. Right? And so if we are able to build up our understanding that cultures are monolithic, that there are dissenting viewpoints within a certain culture, that people have different understandings of animals that we may not know of because we don't know about the diversity in different communities, we can get to a space where we can have a more engaged, thoughtful conversation and not have kind of reform derailed by certain accusations that animal advocates are racist, imperialist, kind of elitist, because they're talking about animals and nothing else. Right? And so Will Kimlicka and Sue Donaldson, two Canadian scholars, have a great piece about this, about why is the left so scared to take on animal issues is because of those fears of being called those names. Right? But if we build up our intersectional capacity, I think we can enter more thoughtful conversations. Okay, and so and part of that is to showcase the diversity of leaders, and here are some Canadians, so I hope some of them are recognizable at least. I don't have time right now to go into all of them, that are doing this kind of leadership work about changing minds and hearts about what to eat and how to think about animals. But I want to come back to a question that I heard earlier today, where I think the last lesson for us really is to understand the power of education, right? Because as much as we try to reach adults in changing their views on animals today, I think what we really need is to get to the children, because this is where intergenerational change will really happen. We need to reach children who haven't yet formed the romanticized, the iconic identity-based associations with eating certain animals, or with thinking of animals in a certain way, or of seeing humans as exceptional and superior. And there are lots of different global examples about animal rights curriculum coming into the curriculum in public schools. And I think that's the #1 intervention we can do, because we know that really the animals dying for our plates or elsewhere are children themselves, if you think of their shortened lifespan. So I think it really makes sense for us to start with empathy for all children, and then cultivating empathy in children for other children. Thank you. And so I think we have some time for questions, so I'm delighted to take your questions, and I believe the microphones are on the side.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Summer, and I'm from the University of British Columbia, so nice to see more Canadians. My question is, and I wanted to ask this earlier in the day, but I was always really busy, so I'm just going to take my chance now,
Yes.
is I get really frustrated by my fellow students, and so often in law, and whenever I read cases, it's always the Floodgate argument that's brought in, and it's almost like a cheap shot to bring up this argument anymore, because I don't think the courts have ever been flooded, in my opinion, in such a disastrous way that we shouldn't be bringing up social issues. And I don't even understand why people keep bringing up the Floodgate arguments, because if there's something that's such a prevalent issue, why should we say, well, the courts can't handle it, therefore let's just ignore these issues? So as a professor, and how do you address that argument when students bring it up in classrooms, or how can we even avoid or just shut down these arguments when all that it's doing is shutting down major issues?
So thank you so much. So the question is a Floodgate argument about, well, if we expand it from the whales to other animals, it'll just be chaos, right? And the whole society will be disrupted. Is that the argument?
Yeah,
yes.
Sorry,
okay,
wasn't
right.
that clear.
Yeah, so yeah, no, it's a powerful argument, but I mean, as we've seen with social change in other spheres, this is the type of arguments that have succeeded before, right? And so I would say what we need to do, I guess, starting with a new generation, is to create a mindset where it's not framed as a floodgate. So if you think of, perhaps, where have we seen generational change in our societies? Maybe a little earlier in Canada, in the United States, a bit more recent, like majorly in terms of a minority going to a majority in its views. We might say it's on the 2S LGBTQ movement, right? Queer movements, and thinking of who can marry, who can adopt children, and so on and so forth. And if you look at some studies or listen to commentators, like, well, how did that happen? A lot of that happened by people talking to others in those identified as those communities, thinking, oh, they're just like us, right? And I think that's a problematic kind of way for things to happen, and it won't happen for animals because you can't humanize in that way. But really, a critical component of that transformative change in society was education of children coming into the curriculum. And you can see it, right, with anti-bullying initiatives, other types of issues, teaching consent laws around sexual activity, and now climate change, right? So I think what really needs to happen is to challenge anyone who's talking about floodgates about a framing issue and show that there have been other major shifts in society and things haven't gone into chaos. And a lot of it in the media right now over climate change and plant-based food is that there's lots of economic opportunities in plant-based kind of industries, right? So that there doesn't have to be this sense of a floodgate into a nothing, into a complete chaotic system.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Hello. I was really interested to hear your discussion of sort of the transition in what we here in the States call the Dietary Guidelines, and sort of the re-representation of what is a healthy diet. I'm curious if you have insights into how we can effectuate a similar change here. So as you might know, right now the 2020 to 2025 guidelines for dietary recommendations are being reformulated, and unfortunately there's not a whole lot of hope that we're going to see much change, and industry leaders, and especially the dairy industry, is going to have a huge voice in that. And so I'm just curious how that change came about, what sort of tactics we might use here, either in the current process or 5 years from now, to see a similar change, to get away from this assumption that drinking 3 glasses of cow's milk a day is the only way to be a healthy person.
Yes, thank you for that question. So how did that change come about in Canada? Well, it really was a shift in government, right? So we went from a conservative Stephen Harper government, which for Canada was probably our most conservative government in recent memory, to the Trudeau government, which was more in the center, perhaps center-left at that time. And so you had civil servants also changing at higher policy levels, so different directions about we need to, and a cognizance that there was heavy critique of the previous guide of government being in bed with industry, right, where you had an advisory council with industry representatives about health and what Canadians should eat. So a real desire not to suffer that same critique, and so, but also that a real resort to science. So, saying we had 200 plus studies looked at, doing public transparency about here are what those studies are, here's the takeaway we're taking, kind of on a consolidated basis. Now here are our recommendations, doing just kind of transparent, open public consultation, but it was to get buy-in for and public democratic acceptance, but really it was that political sensibility in terms of the high policy directives about how the new consultation should be structured, and a very limited role for industry, just as any other contributor could give their input as a member of the public. So I think the two lessons from that is that you need the political will to structure the steps to reform that way. And then again, to go back, I think we really do have to, and how does that political will come about? You need, just like in any negotiation, you kind of have a benchmark that people are going to accept as neutral. And while, again, we can contest science is neutral, this is a major premise for most people that science is neutral. So the more scientific peer-reviewed studies you have showcasing that this really doesn't make sense to have this type of diet, the more someone can go forward and say, hey, it's not me, it's the science, right? And build that political momentum. And it's harder then for people to argue against it. Although, of course, we know people still do argue against science. But that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Sure, if you have time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Deckha. That was wonderful. Thank you. Well, it's been a wonderful day, and I hope all of you have enjoyed the panels and learned as much as I have throughout the day. Our evening is over now, and we will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., so please enjoy the rest of your evening, and we will see you tomorrow morning. Thank you.